What a week it's been. The outgoing Home Secretary accuses the PM of being feeble and untrustworthy. He surprises everyone by appointing a former PM into the government. And then one of his key policies, sending asylum seekers to Rwanda, is thrown out by the highest court in the land. And it's not been the easiest week for Labour either. We will be discussing it all with the people of Bridgwater in Somerset, an historic market town that lies on the River Parrett. And our audience here, as always, reflects the overall electoral picture across the nation. Welcome to Question Time. Conservatives is Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg. He served in the cabinets of both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss before retreating to the backbenches, where he's been a vocal supporter of the recently deposed Home Secretary Suella Braverman. He also presents a nightly TV show on GB News. In 2010, Labour's Bridget Phillipson was elected to Parliament at the age of 26 and describes herself then as a slightly chippy northerner. For the last 2 years, she's been Shadow Secretary of State for Education. Paul Johnson has just released a book called Follow the Money: How Much Does Britain Cost? He heads the Institute for Fiscal Studies, one of the country's leading economics research bodies. Juliet Samuel is a columnist for The Times. Writing about the Rwanda scheme today, she says it's almost impossible now for any country to observe international law and control its borders. And Sriskandarajah is the chief executive of Oxfam GB, who have around 30 staffers working in Gaza. He says the humanitarian crisis there is the worst in his charity's history, and he supports a ceasefire. Good evening. Welcome to our panellists. Welcome to our audience here in Somerset. Lovely to see you. And, of course, welcome to you at home. You can listen to the programme on BBC iPlayer, watch it rather on iPlayer, or listen to it on BBC Sounds. And, of course, you can join in the debate on social media as well. So, we'll start with our first question. The panel, as always, do not know the questions. So let's hear it. Ian Williams.
Is the sacking of Suella Braverman and the return of David Cameron a masterstroke by Rishi Sunak or an act of desperation?
Jacob.
I don't think it's either. I think that it was a mistake to sack Suella because she was saying things that are very important, that the Conservatives need to deal with migration, and there has been some disparity in policing of one type of protest and another. I think the most glaring example is the Sarah Everard vigil against the Black Lives Matter protests, that one of them was allowed to carry on and policemen took the knee, and the other women were arrested and bundled into the back of police vans. That did seem to me to be something that's important to say.
Do you also agree with her points that the current Prime Minister is uncertain, weak and can't be trusted to keep his promises?
I thought her letter was quite jaw-dropping. I've never read a letter of that kind in terms of ministerial resignation. I'm supporting Rishi Sunak. I'm a loyal Tory.
So do you think she was wrong about that?
I think that I wouldn't have phrased it that way. You know, I think there are differences...
Well, so you think she's right, but you'd have used different words?
Not quite. What I'm saying is that there are differences in approach between Suella and between the Prime Minister, and that I don't think it's useful to personalise it in terms of saying people are weak. I would like to see, however, the government pushing ahead with a proper proposal to deal with both legal and illegal migration. Legal migration last year was 606,000 people net.
Now, this is a subject we may come on to later, so you don't feel you have to say a lot about it now. So what about the return of David Cameron? A masterstroke or not?
I think reshuffles make much less difference than people in Westminster think. I think that most people don't really notice reshuffles. They will notice David Cameron because he's been a former Prime Minister. But actually, will he make that much difference to our foreign policy? No, almost certainly not. Is David Cameron a highly intelligent and capable man? Yes, he is. But will he be 10 times better than James Cleverly as Foreign Secretary? No, he will carry on with a competent foreign policy that the government's been following. I think, actually, foreign affairs is an area where this government and Boris Johnson before, as David Cameron himself said, has been doing particularly well.
Bridget?
I mean, it feels to me that it's just really all about the workings of the Conservative Party and less about the interests of the country, that the Conservative Party first and country second when we face really, really big challenges at the moment as a country. With David Cameron, I mean, I was rather surprised to see him back walking down Downing Street. And
well, so were we all, Bridget, I think it's fair to say.
Absolutely. And it feels to me that he's back to finish the job he started in 2010. I mean, we've had 13 years now of Conservative government. When I look at the state of our schools, we've seen a real crisis around schools literally falling into the ground because of a failure to invest in our children's future. It was David Cameron, back in 2010, as Prime Minister, who made the decision as one of the very first acts of that government to cancel a school rebuilding programme. So I think it's time for change. I agree with Rishi Sunak on that, but I think it's change from the Conservatives we need, not more of it. And the way we do that is by the British people having their say in the shape of a general election.
Well, let's let the British people have their say now. The man there in the glasses.
Is this not just a basically to save face, in so much as the difference, as Jacob commented, the difference between their idea and policy between David Cameron and Suella Braverman isn't really that much of a change. However, we would agree that, well, I would hope that the way that Suella presents herself and the way that she presents her policy and her ideas is extremely inflammatory. She's great at making a pig's ear of it. However, David Cameron's great at making it pick something else. Anyway, but yeah, is it not just a publicity? Well, I don't want to say stunt because it's not a stunt, but are we not just saving face for the Conservative government at this point?
OK. Man there in the sweater, yeah.
So I'm not sure whether bringing David Cameron back was a masterstroke or not, but we only got a year to find out. But I do think that the move back towards the centre ground, however that was done, I think that needed to be done because I hate to use the term far right, but the right of the Conservative Party have had a stranglehold on the party ever since Boris Johnson was Prime Minister.
And are you including Jacob in that?
I wouldn't possibly like to comment.
Okay. Man here in the glasses.
Is it right that Cameron got made a lord to be able to come back into government?
Yes.
Why? Why has he been made a lord? Because he can't sit in the Commons now, can he?
Well, actually, you might want to explain that, but because he's not an MP, that's absolutely right.
To serve as a minister, you have to be either in the House of Lords or in the House of Commons. To get into the House of Commons, you obviously have to win election and by-election, but you can go into the Lords by the King's mere motion, and this is done on the advice of the Prime Minister. So this was done with Peter Mandelson. It's been done on a number of occasions in the past to appoint a minister, and that minister needs to be in the Lords to be held accountable by Parliament.
To me, just being a layman, just being an ordinary bloke, it sounds like it's a job for the boy. The boys, it's like a boys' club.
Juliet, would you agree with that?
No, not. I don't agree with that. I think that I think actually there are lots of problems with the House of Lords, but I think this is one of the strengths of it, that you can bring talent quickly into government if you need to do so. Overall, I found the reshuffle a bit depressing because we are 13 years in, and you might think there'd be a new generation of leaders with some energy, and instead we're sort of back to square one a bit. But I think and it speaks to maybe a lack of ready experience to run big departments because we've had so much change over the last few years.
So you think Rishi Sunak just couldn't find anyone else? Anyone
I think
else up
it's
to the job?
difficult to find, ministers with enough experience to run a big department or to run something as complicated as foreign policy. Rishi Sunak is, someone who likes to get into all the details, and you just can't do that when you're the Prime Minister. So I think that was probably an aspect of it. And if Cameron's return, helps to smooth government, then that would be a good thing. But I think on Suella, I think that she had to go because she was repeatedly derailing government. Even though I agree with some of what she was trying to do, the way she presented it and the way she caused chaos was just untenable in the end.
OK, man here.
Well, you're making him a lord.
David Cameron.
David Cameron. Does his money go up a band? His wages?
No. He gets paid as Foreign Secretary, but he doesn't get paid as a Lord. And peers who are ministers do not get the attendance allowance that other peers get.
There you are. There's an answer to your question. Let's hear from the man there in the check shirt.
I think the question for me is what actually is the hidden agenda? I can't imagine David Cameron's come back just for a year until the next election. It feels to me as if there is something more beyond that. You know,
what, you think he's on a promise? You think he's on a promise?
Who knows? Who knows in Westminster who says what to whom? But I wouldn't like to comment on that. But I do think if the Conservatives face an overwhelming defeat, you could see him back as leader of the Conservative Party.
Is that something you would welcome?
I've always found him very relatable. I mean, I know his background's similar to Jacob there, but I've always thought he's really relatable for one reason, which is actually he suffered personal tragedy in his life, and I think that makes him more relatable than most.
The death of his son.
Yeah.
I have to say, you know, when the questions come in every week from all of you, you know, obviously we think we might have an idea what most of you will ask about. The overwhelming majority of you wanted to talk about David Cameron, whether it was for good or not. So, which is why we're doing it first. Paul, so the question is the sacking of Suella Braverman and the return of David Cameron a masterstroke or an act of desperation?
Like Jacob, I don't think it was either. But I'd like to say two things. I mean, first, I think it's quite good, in a way, if experienced ministers can come back. I've spoken to a number of ex-ministers, and they all, rightly or wrongly, think they might do a better job second time round. When it comes to if you were going to move the Foreign Secretary and you've got a year of Parliament to go, kind of springing a complete unknown on the rest of the world probably isn't the best way of pushing the British agenda. So having an ex-Prime Minister, I suspect, probably is quite a good thing if you're going to move the current Foreign Secretary, which brings me to my second point, which is that actually we've had an absurd amount of movement of ministers over the last 5 years. I thought something like this might come up, so I kind of counted back. We've had, I think, 6 education secretaries, 5 health secretaries, 5 environment secretaries.
6 chancellors?
Possibly, I didn't even count them, since 2019. We've had, I think, 14...
Well, mine since 2013, but yes, go on.
14 housing ministers since 2010. So in each case, we've had more than one a year. You can't begin to get on top of the health service, the education system, issues in the environment within a year. It takes a lot longer than that. So actually, this continual reshuffling has been one of the things, I think, which has stopped us getting a good housing policy, a consistent environment policy, an effective grip on health policy, and so on. So I really wish we could have had much more stability in that. So that costs us, because we get less good policy. And I think that degree of inconsistency also costs the economy, because businesses want some degree of certainty about where we're going. When you've got that amount of turnover, we have very little sense of that.
Yes, exactly. 6 chancellors since 2010. I mean, it moves around, but it's quite hard to keep track of it. So, Danny, masterstroke, act of desperation?
Well, it's not for me to comment on that, but I am also interested in David Cameron, because I'm trying to work out how is David Cameron feeling sitting around a cabinet table, given that, you know, when he was Prime Minister, in fact, I saw him in New York in 2015 making a pledge to leave no one behind. He, you know, when he was Prime Minister, he talked about the importance of doing whatever we can to leave no one behind, here in the UK and globally. But in the years since...
And sorry, what did he mean by that?
He meant that we need to bring those who are most needy up and level the playing field, address inequality. But in the last 10 years, we've seen poverty and hunger and inequality rise here in the UK and globally. This is a man who went to the Arctic, remember, and hugged a husky and sort of told about his green credentials. Since then, the government has been rolling back on all sorts of commitments around net zero. He's the one who took his shadow cabinet to Rwanda, of all places, and came back and admirably became the first government in the world to legislate that 0.7% of national income would be spent on international aid to help the most poor people out in the world. But since then, this is a government that's been cutting aid, billions taken out of our aid budget. So I can't quite work out why he wants to be part of a government that seems to have undone so many of the promises that he made while he was Prime Minister.
And do you welcome him coming back?
Well, I want Britain to go back and have a great standing on the world stage. You know, when I talk to Oxfam colleagues around the world, when I talk to political figures around the world, it is clear our standing in the world has suffered in recent years. People are worried about our commitments to the green agenda. People are worried about our commitment to international law. People are worried about aid cuts. And I fear that in the year or so that he'll have left, that he won't have the time to restore Britain to its rightful place as a protector of the rule of law, as a champion of human rights, as a champion of international development.
Well, let's move on to the second question that lots and lots of you asked about. Before we do, I will say just that Question Time is in Stevenage in Hertfordshire next week, where we have on our panel, we have the great British sewing bee businessman Patrick Grant. He'll be there, amongst others. And if you'd like to be in the audience, go to the Question Time website. You can follow the instructions there. In fact, all our locations where we're going to be over the coming weeks, right through until our first programme after Christmas, that's January the 11th next year, will be in Oxford. So if you want to apply to any of those programmes, come and be part of the audience. We'd love to see you. Right, let's take our next question from Jim Sean.
With the recent Supreme Court ruling, is it time we finally abandon the Rwanda policy?
Right, well, there we are. This was quite a big decision, quite a blow to the government, obviously yesterday by the Supreme Court. Bridget?
I sincerely hope that the government now give up on this unworkable farce of a policy and move on to something better, more effective and more humane. And, you know, I agree with the new Home Secretary who described the policy as being batshit. I mean, it's just not going to work. It's not the right approach. It's costing us £140 million, and it's all because we're just, as a country, not processing those cases that are there. Huge backlogs of cases. I've seen that myself as a constituency MP. Colleagues right across the House of Commons say that they've just got so many of these cases that aren't being processed. And that means we're spending £8 million a day on putting people up in completely unsuitable accommodation, such as hotels.
And when it comes to Labour's policy, and on a number of times on the programme we've had people from the Labour Shadow Cabinet talking about what they would do. One of the things that you suggest, as well as trying to deal with the backlog of asylum claims, is try to smash the gangs, the smuggling gangs.
Yeah.
That's surely a lot easier said than done. What makes you think that you can do that where others have failed?
So we'll put the money that would be spent on this ridiculous Rwanda policy directly into cross-border working, a new cell of the National Crime Agency, to work with the French to embed officers in Europol and to crack down, take very, very seriously the need to crack down on criminal gangs and to process the cases alongside that too. We've got to work with our international partners on this. We've got to work with people like the French to make that happen.
So you want to take that £140 million and spend it on that?
We will spend it on cracking down on the criminal smuggling gangs and on making sure we've got a far more robust response where it comes to people smuggling. Absolutely. That should be the priority of government. Alongside that, more caseworkers. Let's clear the backlog. Part of the pull that people see is they know that it takes years and years for cases to be processed. Now, that's not fair on the people who have genuine cases to be heard, who are here for good reason and have a right to protection. It's not fair on them. It's not fair on our country. And I just think, you know, you look at it, it's costing a fortune, it's not working. We've got to find a different way of doing things. It doesn't sound, however, like the government have any intention of moving on and doing that.
So, Jacob, is it time to abandon the Rwanda policy after the Supreme Court judgment yesterday?
No, it isn't. What needs to be done is the incentive to come here needs to be removed. And currently the incentive to come here is that you will be able to stay. And this is making a lot of money for illegal gangs, and it is leading to people drowning in the Channel. It has a high human cost. And we need to have something in place that removes that pull and removes the money-making for the illegal people smugglers.
And do you think the government can do it?
Yes, I think the government can. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that the court yesterday referred a great deal to the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which itself processes refugees in Rwanda. The UNHCR processes Libyan refugees in Rwanda. So it's clearly not that outrageous a thing to do. Otherwise, the UNHCR, which doesn't want the UK government to do it, wouldn't be doing it itself.
Well, the UK government would wanted the Rwandan government to do it,
yes,
as opposed to the UNHCR.
And that's a very fair point. It may be that we should send our people to do the processing. But why do we need to do it? We need to do it to stop the pull. And how can we do it? Well, it's very interesting. There's been an argument about the power of Parliament to override the courts. Little noticed, just before the prorogation of Parliament recently, a bill went through, becoming an act, reversing the Supreme Court decision that said that Gerry Adams had been unlawfully interned when his document was signed by a Minister of State, not the Secretary of State. This was reversed by Act of Parliament, so that Gerry Adams and others like him did not have to be paid compensation. It is routine in our constitution for the High Court of Parliament, which makes the law, to change laws that judges have developed. That is a perfectly proper constitutional process in a common law jurisdiction.
Jacob, as you will know, people are lining up to say that the government can't do this and can't just override the judgment of the Supreme Court. You yourself have said, hang on, let me finish. You yourself have said, sadly, this government no longer seems serious about handling illegal or even legal migration. So I'm asking you, do you think Rishi Sunak is up for it?
We will have to wait and see. But I was making the point about Gerry Adams to show that it can be done, and it has been done recently. I'm not referring to my favourite 17th century parliamentary precedent. This is something that has happened in the last few weeks. It's really important. Our system recognises the supremacy of Parliament representing you, the voters. And that's where the law is made. The courts rule and judge on the laws Parliament has made. So
well,
Parliament
it's an interesting point. As
override.
you know, there are many people lining up today who disagree with you and disagree with that point, saying the government cannot overrule the rule of courts. Danny?
I worry about two things in this debate. One is that we too often lose sight of the fact that we're talking about real people and real lives. Many of these people are fleeing persecution, they're fleeing war, they're doing things that most of us would do if we were facing these same circumstances. And yet it feels like we're playing a sort of cruel games with their lives through these policies that are not going to work, that are not going to fix the fundamental challenges of an asylum system that's overwhelmed and it's broken. Moving people to Rwanda isn't going to fundamentally deliver a better asylum system or migration system for us. And the second thing I worry about is that politicians in this arena of policymaking seem to be over-promising and under-delivering, and they've been doing it for years and years. They come up with the latest gimmick that they think is going to solve this, incredibly complex area of public policy making. And my other worry is that it's going to just chip away at public trust in politics, because that's what politicians seem to always do, is they say, we're going to reach for this solution that's going to solve it. It's not. We need a concerted effort to fix the asylum system, a concerted effort to work with other countries, countries of origin, countries of transit, to slow down and treat more humanely these flows of people.
Woman there at the back.
Has Brexit effectively left the government without any credible or constructive means of managing illegal migration, so it's now clutching at straws with these radical policies?
And you're saying Brexit, what, because of the Dublin Convention?
The ability to actually engage constructively with other countries across the EU to try and manage the flow of migration from these countries and try to actually manage it in a more constructive way.
OK, we'll come to that. Yes, woman there.
Would you advocate pushing back the boats to France and in a short term for to be able to stop the traffickers pushing people in?
Pushing people into the water?
No, pushing people into the country. So stop. If you push the boats back to France, let France do the whatever legal necessary to just stop the traffickers dead, sending people over in boats to the UK.
Is that something you'd like to see?
It's something that should be considered.
So people coming across on the dinghies, you'd like to see them
pushed back to France,
pushed back,
so that the traffickers can be stopped there and then, because they, before they even start getting on the boats.
Would you worry about people drowning in those circumstances?
Well, obviously, and a lot of people are drowning in dreadful circumstances, and that's really not on. But on the other hand, are the French rescuing as many people and taking them back to France as we're rescuing and bringing them into the UK? I don't know.
OK. Juliet, let me come to you. After yesterday's Supreme Court ruling, is it time to abandon the Rwanda policy?
I think the Rwanda policy in its current form is dead, basically. I don't think what the government's doing at the moment is going to work.
So the government's suggesting coming up with a new law, which they try and pass very quickly, to basically, after having done work with the Rwandan government, to make Rwanda safe. That's how it's...
Yes, and I think it was Lord Sumption this morning who was saying, obviously Parliament, as Jacob said, can make law and can decide the courts are wrong, but it is unprecedented for Parliament to say that the facts that the court has considered are wrong. And when Parliament has tried before to pass laws that break international law, for example, which we had over Brexit and Northern Ireland, it ultimately didn't work. It didn't fly. It wasn't going to go through. This is a much more substantial change. I think it's a risky constitutional change. And I think, given the risk of damage to the rule of law and the fact that it's not going to work, I don't think it's the right approach.
Now, I introduced you by saying that you didn't think that a country could control its borders and also comply with international law.
Yeah, I think the backdrop to this is that there is a huge rise globally, but particularly in Europe, in migration numbers, and that's driven by a variety of factors, one of which is technology, and the cost of movement has come down, in part because of technology. And the overall problem is that this country and all countries in Europe have a limited capacity and willingness and political capacity to take in refugees. And there are 30 million refugees in the world, and we can't possibly take in as many as there's demand for. And so the question is, how do you ration our capacity to take in refugees? And I don't think currently that, we have this race to Dover, almost a sort of awful Hunger Games race, and that's how we ration it, just who can get here. And then, you enter this broken asylum system, and that's that. And it seems to me we need to, as Jacob said, we need to remove the incentive to come through, to come on a boat. We need a policy like Rwanda, but we need to do it in a way that is going to work legally. Now, I think the best way to do that would be for the UK to talk to like-minded countries, of whom there are many in Europe. Germany, Italy, Denmark, Austria are just those who've been explicit about it so far.
Which is what the woman at the back was suggesting, and you were suggesting that maybe Brexit had made that harder.
I actually think that Dublin is a bit of a red herring, because actually very few people were ever actually returned through the Dublin Agreement, and the treaties that the Supreme Court mentioned as being a barrier to this policy are not actually EU treaties. They're treaties that governments have signed up to. And so it would be appropriate, and I think it could work, to get together with those governments to say we need to adjust these treaties and find a way to make this work.
OK, thank you. Woman here.
I don't agree with pushing back the boats, but what I think should be done is, you see all the migrants and with the pirates putting them on the boats. Why can't the French have like a knife or something and just do it before it even gets in the water?
You mean, just to be clear, you mean to puncture the boat, not to use it on anybody?
No, not to use it.
I thought we were taking a whole new turn there, which is a bit alarming.
And then the boats wouldn't even be in the water for them to drown, because they wouldn't get off the beaches.
What the French say is a long coastline, and actually to be in the right place at the right time to do that is difficult.
Wow. I mean, you see it on television where there's a drone and they're watching everybody coming out and getting on. I mean...
So you basically want them to do more, that's the thing. That's what you're saying. OK, man there in the glasses and the dark sweater. Yeah.
Just a quick question. Why was Rwanda chosen as the first part? And secondly, if you see Rwanda as being a deterrent and stopping the boats, then surely you must feel that Rwanda is a worse place to be than the United Kingdom?
Do you know the answer to the first question? You can certainly answer the second.
The answer to the first question is what was practical and available. So I did sit on meetings looking at whether we could use the Ascension Islands, which was a ridiculous idea. I mean, it would have cost us hundreds of thousands of pounds per person removed there.
And presumably, to the second point, it's a disincentive because Rwanda's not quite as
But the answer
such
to
a great place to be as here. That's what you're saying.
But the best place to live in the world is Somerset. And everybody knows, that.
Don't play to the crowd. He's making a serious point.
But my answer's serious. People want to come and live in the United Kingdom. And they then mainly, if they've got any sense, want to come and live in Somerset because it is the best place in the world to live. And that's why we have a problem with migration, to go to the serious point, is that people want to come here because of the freedoms we enjoy, because of our standard of living. And yes, of course, people would rather come here than Rwanda. Obviously.
Paul. After yesterday's Supreme Court ruling, is it time to abandon the Rwanda policy?
Well, I think it's important to say what was the point of the Rwanda policy? It's part of the Prime Minister's pledge to stop the boats coming over, and that, for the reason we've heard, I mean, that's an incredibly dangerous way to get here. It's worth putting this in context. I mean, there are fewer people coming over this year than last, and I think that reflects a lot of work in the way that the lady earlier who wanted to take a knife to the boats was talking about. Actually, the French, with quite a lot of British money, have been doing more on that. But the scale is small. We're looking at probably 30,000 people coming over in this route this year. That's against a total immigration of people staying here long-term of probably more than 1 million. So this is a very small fraction of the total number of people coming into the country. But I think the second really important point is the one that Juliet made, which is that the pressure here is only going to grow over time. There's more problems in the world. There's more war and more issues with people being pushed out by demography, huge increases in the numbers of people in Africa over the next 30 or 40 years. That's going to put incredible pressure on all of Western Europe and other parts of the world, and we do need international agreements to get there. One other sort of thing it's worth saying, we do take, per head of population, fewer asylum seekers by some considerable distance than the EU average, and fewer per head of population than most big countries in the EU, partly because we are harder to get to. But the only way that we're going to deal with this is through long-term strategies with other countries, recognising the big international pressures that are building up. And I don't think sort of these sort of one-off policies, quite difficult policies to implement, like Rwanda. And the last point is, this is supposed to disincentivise people. It's an empirical question as to whether it will. At the moment, even if the policy had gone ahead, we might be talking about 1,000 or 2,000 a year going to Rwanda. That's the kind of capacity they have at the moment. Whether people, those coming over, would consider that enough of a disincentive to change their behaviour, we actually, as an empirical fact, don't know. And I think until you got it up to virtually everyone, I think the chances are it probably wouldn't actually have much effect on the numbers coming across.
The woman in the middle there with the glasses, can we get a microphone there? Yeah.
I think there's been so much effort put into getting this Rwanda policy to work when it doesn't even deal with the root cause of the problem. I mean, if anybody here has ever moved house, just moving house, you know how stressful that is. Can you think what situation these families would have to be in, these people would have to get to? That they're not just moving house, they're taking their whole families. They're going somewhere they might not speak the language. They're walking for miles. You just think, you know, should we really be addressing that and answering that agony with fear and policies of fear, or should we be looking with compassion and thinking, what can we do as a power in a global country to make it so people don't have to leave their homes? What can we do with the aid budget? What can we do with ceasefires? How can we help make the whole world a safe place to live?
Okay, and the man here in the front in the green shirt.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Rwanda project still has legs. From my understanding of the hearing, one of the main issues was the fact about this possible reformment, or returning back to their original place of conflict.
Sending asylum seekers back to a country where they would be at risk or in danger.
Yeah. So I think that's that should be an easy fix for Prime Minister Cameron.
Oh, was that a Freudian slip there?
But, so I think that's a fairly easy fix, and I think they will push this through. I think they will get this agreement, and they are going to change the law, if need be, to make this work. It is already working. I believe this drop in a third of the boats that have coming over this year, I think partly that is down to the work in Europe, but also I think it is already the thought that if they do get here, even a year's time, they may still then be sent on to Rwanda, so it's already deterring some people, I think.
Okay. All right, I'm going to take another question. Lots of you want to talk about this as well. Linda Bond, where are you?
Is the Israeli targeting of hospitals in Gaza collective punishment or the elimination of terrorism?
So what we're seeing in Israel at the moment, it's the sort of, it's the kind of centre of activity at the moment, the Israeli army, where they are in the Al-Shifa hospital and around the Al-Shifa hospital, which is the biggest hospital in Gaza City. And the Israeli army is saying that they believe that there is a Hamas command and control centre beneath it, in the tunnels beneath it, and so far they found some weapons which they say belong to Hamas. Danny, obviously you've got people in Gaza. What's your view?
It's collective punishment. We need to be clear what happened in Israel, what Hamas did in Israel on the 7th of October was horrendous. But what's been happening since then is also horrendous. I have, as Fiona said, we have 31 colleagues in Gaza. These are brave, incredible, amazing colleagues who I had the pleasure and privilege of meeting just a few months ago when I visited Gaza. They should be providing relief services, but they're running for their lives. We would normally be in contact with them constantly. We can't get hold of them because their phones don't work, the electricity isn't there. We would normally be telling the warring parties where our staff and civilians are so that we can avoid them being hurt. But no one is safe. And worst of all, we're in 2023 and food is being used as a weapon of war. Starvation is being used as a weapon of war. It feels grossly unfair that over 10,000 people, many children, are dying, and our political leaders don't have the moral courage to call for a ceasefire. I just don't understand that.
Juliet? No, I don't think it is collective punishment. I think Israel is engaged in a terrible war to remove a threat, a huge threat to its citizens. There are more than 200 Israeli hostages, including children, toddlers, babies, being held probably in tunnels under Gaza. No government could accept that an atrocity of the kind that Hamas perpetrated can go unanswered and can go without removal of the threat, removal of the capacity to perform an act like that. And also that could possibly leave its citizens to languish or at the hands of the most brutal terrorist group. So I think that it's completely unreasonable to expect any government to not respond and to try to remove this threat. I think that in terms of the hospital and the way that Israel's conducting this war, it is a very, very difficult situation. You have a densely populated city, urban area where basically a terrorist regime has embedded itself over decades. They have, deliberately used the civilian population as shields, put themselves under hospitals, under playgrounds, under apartment blocks. They suffer no consequence for that in terms of global opinion. It doesn't seem to dent support for them at all. So there's no incentive for them not to do that. And so the Israeli army is trying to perform an incredibly difficult task to make the country safer, to remove this threat, which, by the way, moving the Hamas regime would be an excellent thing, most of all for Palestinians who suffer the most from the kind of regime that they run. Unfortunately, it is a terrible situation, and Gazans are paying the price for what Hamas has done. But if you look at other situations where similar groups like ISIS have had to be removed in Mosul or in Raqqa, you've also had very terrible urban warfare in which civilians have suffered. And yet we haven't had this questioning of the mission that, we could just leave ISIS in place, or there should be a ceasefire, which, by the way, will only ever be respected by one side, because we know that Hamas has never respected ceasefires. So you're effectively asking one side to unconditionally leave its hostages and leave this threat in place. We did not have that debate over ISIS because the world saw that ISIS was a great evil and it had to be removed. And I think it is exactly the same situation with Hamas.
All right, there's lots of hands up. Let's hear from someone. Man there in the glasses.
How do the critics of Israel think they should have dealt with Hamas after? Not go in or...
Not kill 5,000 children.
All right. Down here in the front.
I think Hamas must have known exactly what was going to happen when they killed the 1,400 people. And it seems to me that, like Putin, they're not interested in their own people. They're just interested in their own ideology.
Man there in the red.
I think that it's, this is a massively complicated debate, and passions are very high on both sides. I think for me the big concern is where does this leave the peace process? Where does this leave the two-state solution? Because actually, until we get peace, and you can argue that Netanyahu's an extremist, Hamas are extremists, they both do things to the other side, but actually, until we get people sitting around a table talking, people are going to keep dying on both sides, and that's where the real sort of worry for me is are we ever going to get a two-state solution and peace in Palestine, Israel?
Woman here in the grey sweater. You had your hand up.
Oh, sorry, I did, yes. I think one of the reasons that so many people have been killed in Palestine, Palestinians, is that there was just no time for them to get to a safe place. There weren't safe places. And so I think the continuous bombing has really, really taken its toll and driven the numbers up. So why wasn't the rest of the world demanding that time was given for people to move to safe places and to create those safe places? And just seeing the scenes that we see on the television of all the deaths, it's appalling.
Bridget.
It's devastating to see every day on our television screens the suffering of children, of civilians, what they're experiencing, and that's why, you know, we in the Lib Party have been clear we need desperately to see humanitarian aid getting in much, much bigger numbers than has been the case so far.
But what you're not doing, which is what Danny was saying, is Danny is calling for leaders to have the moral courage to call for a ceasefire, and Labour and the government too are not doing that.
Yeah, I don't support that approach. And I'll just come back to what happened on the 7th of October, which events are still emerging. And again, every day we hear further horrifying reports about the scale of the barbarity that Hamas inflicted on innocent Israeli civilians. And it is appalling and utterly shocking to read. And that's why I don't think it is achievable that we will get to a position of a ceasefire. Hamas have no interest in such a ceasefire. They are a terrorist organisation who have said that given a chance, they will do again and again and again exactly what they did to innocent people on the 7th of October.
So why
That's
is
not
it
to
that
say, however,
almost
that Israel
a third...
has a blank cheque. That is not to say that Israel has a blank cheque.
Why is it that almost a third of Labour's MPs don't agree with you, don't agree with Keir Starmer, and voted for a ceasefire?
Because all of us...
Are they all wrong?
No, what we all believe is that we want to see more humanitarian aid. We want to see the release of hostages. We want to make sure that international law is respected. We all feel incredibly strongly about that. Who couldn't be moved by what we see every day? No one would fail to be horrified by the scenes on our televisions. But where we have a vote in Parliament and where there is a decision taken around the approach of the party, then it is right that those of us who are members of the front bench have a responsibility to abide by collective responsibility. And I'm very sorry that some colleagues were not able to vote with the Labour whip on that issue and therefore took the decision to step back from the front bench. But it is important, as Keir Starmer has set out in the speech he gave in Chatham House, we have a position and it's our responsibility to push the government for more, especially around humanitarian pauses. We do need to see that. Right. The US have been clear about that too. It's desperate.
Jacob. Is the Israeli targeting of hospitals, which incidentally the head of the World Health Organization has called totally unacceptable, is it a collective punishment or elimination of terrorism?
It is an attempt to eliminate terrorism. And the gentleman there with the glasses made absolutely the right point. What do people expect Israel to do after 1,400 of her people were massacred? A ceasefire is a victory for Hamas, because they will carry on. As Juliet said, they will not obey it. And to come to the hospital specifically, I'm going to quote from the Times, because I think it's important to look at this properly in terms of the Geneva Convention. Article 18 states that in no circumstances should a hospital treating the sick and wounded be the object of attack. Article 19 says that such protection ceases if the hospital is being used to commit acts outside its humanitarian remit. And the hospital, we have known since 2007 by a report from Human Rights Watch that said that Hamas had fired a rocket at its Palestinian rival Fatah from the complex. And in 2015, Amnesty International, not a friend of the Jewish state, not a friend of the British government, said that International reported that the group used an empty outpatient clinic on the site to interrogate and torture people suspected of collaborating with Israel. So Hamas has been using the protection of a hospital to carry out terrorist-inspired interrogations and actions of terror. What are the Israelis supposed to do?
Jacob,
what would the British government do? What would we ask our armed forces to do if there were a hospital being used in some part of the United Kingdom as a base for terrorist outrages? We would, of course, send in our forces to stop it. And there is a dreadful moral equivocating about defending the right of Israel to protect itself from these evil attacks.
Danny.
Jacob, I don't think anyone's questioning the right of... I don't think the question here is about the right of Israel to defend itself. It's about humanitarian law, and I'm glad you brought it up, because that same article talks about everything feasible needing to be done before a hospital is targeted, that the combatants must take precautionary measures, and most importantly, must be proportionate. You know, the WHO head said earlier this week that a child is dying every 10 minutes in Gaza. 6 children in the course of recording of this programme. Is that proportionate? Is that the right response to what's happened in Israel?
Is providing incubators for newborn babies.
But there's not the fuel to power the incubators.
But what is providing battery-powered ones as it happens? What is proportionate to people who have stored Kalashnikovs in a hospital? That they will come out with and shoot you with, and they will cross your border and kill innocent people out of all things, a peace rally. What is proportionate when people are murdering and are preparing to murder? What are you supposed to do? You say you're absolutely right. You made the fundamental point. What do the opponents of Israel expect her to do?
One here in the green. Hang on, let's get a microphone to you. There you go.
I think it's really interesting that you just said that they're providing incubators when we've just heard that there's no electricity.
They're providing battery ones. So that seems to me... the Israelis are trying to minimise civilian casualties. Of course they are. Dare I say, much more than we tried in the Second World War, when we were dealing with a fundamental threat to our nation.
Hang on, because I think, Danny, you don't agree with that.
Absolutely not. Gaza is one of the most densely populated places on the planet. There is bombing going on all over the place, including the so-called safe zones where people have been urged. You know, Al-Mawasi at the south of Gaza is where people are being told to go. It's an area the size of London Heathrow Airport. And we think 1 million people are going into an area with absolutely no infrastructure, absolutely no electricity, little food, no running water, no sanitation. This is not proportionate. This is collective punishment of people who had nothing to do with what happened in Israel on the 7th of October.
I'm going to squeeze in another question from Christine Donnelly.
What would the panel like to see in next week's autumn statement?
Right, next week's autumn statement, and of course the autumn statement is, is the government's moment to give an update on the economy and announce any new taxation, cutting off taxes, public spending, that kind of thing. Paul, come on, let's hear from you, Mr. Institute of Fiscal Studies. What would you like to see in next week's autumn statement?
Well, I'd like to see, first of all, some honesty about the really quite difficult position that we're in. There's been lots of discussions about tax cuts and so on. And I can understand why there have been discussions about tax cuts. Taxes are actually at their highest level ever in this country at the moment. And they've gone up more over this Parliament than over any Parliament since the Second World War. So you can see why there's a pressure to do this. So why are we in that position? Well, partly because actually spending has grown a fair bit, though we haven't seen much in the way of results in public services, it has to be said. Partly because growth has been so poor, and partly because we're spending £100 billion a year on debt interest, and that bill is set to remain quite high over the coming years. The consequence is that if you look at the budget numbers, the government says that it's going to be cutting public service spending in some areas over the next 3 or 4 years. And even doing that, you still have debt not coming down. And both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party have said that they want to get debt down into the medium term. So we are in a pretty difficult situation, and that gives us some pretty difficult choices. So we could say that taxes are very high, we need to take them down a bit, and there are certainly some taxes I would like to see cut. Stamp duty, land tax is a particular example, but if you're going to cut taxes at all significantly, you have to say alongside that where you're going to find savings on the spending side. Equally, if you want to increase spending, then you're going to have to say something on the tax side. What I'd really like to see is a programme which is going to provide us with more growth over the medium run, and we kind of know how to do that, actually. We just decide not to. So planning reform would be one obvious thing to do. Tax reform of multiple kinds would certainly help. We need to invest more in education, particularly vocational and further education for those kids who don't go on to university. We need to protect the infrastructure budget. Actually, the government is planning to cut that pretty significantly.
So do you think any of those things are likely?
Well, there is some tax reform coming. I hope and expect that there'll be a change to corporation tax announced in the budget in March, which gives more incentives to invest. That was for 3 years. I hope that goes on for a couple more years. People have talked a bit about changing some aspects of the tax system, particularly, as I said, stamp duty. That would help a little bit. The government has given a bit more money to schools, but there might be more scope for that. But what I really want, from both sides actually, is some serious laying before us of these really tough problems. This high level of tax, significantly paying for very high debt interest payments and not giving us great public services, gives us some really tough choices.
And you also started saying you'd like a bit of honesty. Bridget, what would you like to see in next week's autumn statement?
I agree with Paul that there are lots and lots of challenges there, and the economy is certainly in a real mess at the moment. And that's about longer-term problems that we've seen over the last 13 years, but I'd also say it's about the immediate problems we saw just a year or so ago when we had that devastating mini-budget that means lots of people every month are paying more on their mortgages than would otherwise have been the case. I think that shows what comes of not being serious and responsible where it comes to how you manage the public finances, and that's what Rachel Reeves, our Shadow Chancellor, has been setting out in terms of the need for a different approach. Absolutely, growth has to be central to that. The reason that we've had so much less to spend on our public services over the last 13 years is partly due to the fact we haven't had growth in our economy. Governments of all persuasions... The question is, what
would you like to see?
Absolutely. Governments of all persuasions face choices about how they raise money and how they spend money. So, for example, I agree that we need to see much more done where it comes to skills and schools and education. That will be absolutely central to how we make our country a better place to be. So one example around that would be the plans that we've set out around more apprenticeships, around better investment in skills training, and Labour's Green Prosperity Plan, which is about harnessing all of those opportunities that come of the shift that we'll need to make around climate change. Alongside that, choices I think the government right now could and should be making about priorities. So, for example, we would end the tax benefits that private schools enjoy, and we put that money directly into more teachers in our classrooms, better mental health support for our children, and a real push around making sure every child gets the best possible start in life.
Jacob.
Well, I agree with a lot of what Paul was saying, that we can't just cut taxes.
What, lack of growth over the last 13 years, flatlining economy, all that kind of thing?
My sentence,
well, I'm just saying that's what he said.
You know what I mean. He said that we need to cut spending if we're to cut taxes, and that must be right. We need expenditure under control. I was delighted by the announcement of cutting HS2. That was a big saving. I was less pleased that all that money was then going to be spent. I also agree with Paul that we need planning reform. Planning holds back this economy massively. It means people can't afford houses. It means businesses can't expand their sites. It is one of the real failings of the UK economy and has been now for decades.
And presumably one of the failings of the government.
Well, it dates back to 1947 when there was a Labour government.
Yes, but in the last 13 years...
Hey, we should have reformed it. Unquestionably, we should have reformed it. And it's a pity we haven't. We need more deregulation. We should have done the retained EU law bill to get rid of more EU laws so that we have a better chance for growth. And we should model ourselves on Nigel Lawson, the late and much revered Nigel Lawson, who in every budget abolished one tax, and the one I would abolish would be death duties, which is affordable and would cost about £7 billion and would show that we're in favour of the long term and of people keeping the money they've earned during their lifetimes.
So that's inheritance tax you're talking about. Yes, the woman there with the scarf in the middle.
With the cutting of the education and training budget, how is the government going to actually, for elderly people, or now that the pension age is rising, people who can no longer do a physical job and will need retraining, because there's going to be a massive cost to those people in terms of benefits if they can't work and they can't retrain because, until they retire? Okay. It's not just children who are going to suffer through lack of training and development.
All right, the man in front of you in the blue sweater.
I think business rates reform is one of the most important things. If you go down Bridgwater High Street, I think about 1 in every 2 shops is now vacant. They're so high, it's putting people off starting a business altogether.
Okay. Juliet, what would you like to see in next week's autumn statement?
I would like to see a really thought through and broader industrial strategy. And by that I mean, I think the government needs to look broadly at the economy in the context of changes that are going on in the world, subsidies being unleashed in the US, in Europe, and also rising insecurity and the supply chains we have sprawling across the world that we haven't really examined for vulnerabilities, and a long-term decline in the British capacity to make things or to have allies make things that we then contribute to. And I think part of that is that we need more investment, some of that in a targeted and disciplined way, because money is tight from the government. But, you know, for example, like the electric battery factory here in Somerset, which the government has put some money towards. But I think, you know, there are other ways that you could do that to encourage investment. Some of it may be through tax cuts, whereby you would, you know, encourage money to go towards productive investment. Business rates might be a good way of doing that, for example, because, you know, businesses are the engine of growth in the economy. And so I wouldn't support a tax cut that, you know, targets something like inheritance tax, although in principle I have nothing against it. I just think in all the priorities that we have at the moment with low growth, that's not the one that's going to move the dial for our future prosperity.
And Paul, you're nodding at that.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways you could cut taxes. I don't think the inheritance tax would be near the top of my list. I'd like to reform inheritance tax and actually potentially cut the rate. I mean, the problem with inheritance tax at the moment, it's a very high rate, 40%. It's actually only people who have got significant but relatively modest estates, and modest is in relative terms. But we know that if you've got an estate of £2 million, you pay twice as much as a fraction of your estate in inheritance tax than if you've got one of £10 million. And the reason is, if you have a lot of assets which go beyond your home, it's pretty easy to avoid inheritance tax in terms of the sorts of assets that you can buy on which inheritance tax isn't paid. I think it's one reason people think it's pretty unfair, because they see really rich people not paying very much of it, whereas modestly rich people pay quite a lot. So I think I'd quite like to see a cut in the inheritance tax rate, but the quid pro quo for that is that we start to charge inheritance tax on a much broader range of assets.
Danny.
Well, in some ways, I worry that we spend a lot of time focusing on the autumn statement, the budget, this month's inflationary figures, while we're ignoring the fundamental problem, which isn't just a cost of living crisis, which we're seeing, it's a cost of inequality crisis. We have seen wages stagnate, we've seen the public services hollowed out, we've seen the benefit system broken, and we haven't got the bold ideas from any of the major political figures I can see to fix that, for a fundamental reset of the way that our society works so that it is fairer, so that people can feel included. And that's my worry. Inequality is rising. Poverty is rising in this country in 2023. I think that's unacceptable, and I doubt very much we're going to see the fundamental fixes needed in this autumn statement, or perhaps for several to come.
OK, well, we shall see. It's next week. That's it, I'm afraid. Sorry to those of you who got your hands up. Our hour is up. Thank you very much for coming along this evening. Thank you, of course, to the panel as well. Thank you at home for watching. And remember, if you don't want to stay up late, you can watch us first and live on iPlayer at 8 o'clock. But from all of us here, from Bridgwater in Somerset, until next week, bye-bye.
Is Keir Starmer facing his biggest crisis yet? And David Cameron's surprise return to politics. Stay with us for Newscast next on BBC One.